Russia's President Vladimir Putin orders troops into 2 breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine after officially recognizing them as independent. How will the global community react? I'll break it all down here on Straight Talk. Hello and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm Ayşe Süberker. For months, fears of an attack on Ukraine grew as a Russian military buildup along their border swelled to over 150,000 troops. In a major escalation, Russia's President Vladimir Putin ordered troops into 2 separatist regions in eastern Ukraine, which he officially recognized as independent. Putin called the deployment a peacekeeping mission, which was swiftly condemned by the US and EU. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy made a late-night address saying his country was not afraid and would not give anything to anyone. The UN Security Council held an emergency meeting late Monday where several nations condemned Russia's moves as a violation of international law and Ukraine's sovereignty. US President Joe Biden imposed sanctions on the 2 breakaway regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, where Russian troops have been deployed. Turkiye's foreign ministry was also swift in its condemnation of Russia, calling its latest moves unacceptable. So, is this crisis headed towards further escalation? And what will the international response be? And to answer that, I'm joined from Oslo by Glenn Diesen. He is a professor at the University of Southeastern Norway. From Kiev, Peter Zalmayev. He is the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. And from Yalova, Turkiye, Mehmet Ali Uğur. He is an assistant professor of international relations at Yalova University. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. Thank you very much for joining me. Sure. The West has repeatedly warned Russia not to recognize these 2 breakaway regions of Donetsk and Luhansk. It seems that those warnings have fallen on deaf ears. So, Glenn, what's your take on Putin's decision and how significant its timing?
Well, I guess didn't fall completely on deaf ears because the Russians did follow this, try to have this Minsk agreement implemented for the past 7 years. So while the West did promise, did push Russia towards not recognizing the Donetsk and Lugansk, at the same time, they did not push to actually follow the peace agreement. So again, if we go back to February of 2015, this is when the Minsk II agreement came in place, in which it was stated on day 1, Kyiv should engage in diplomacy with Donbas and then work towards granting the region some autonomy. Now, Kyiv was very specific, especially under Zelenskyy, that they would not consider this. They wouldn't talk to Donbas, and they will not give them any autonomy in accordance with this agreement. At the same time, the US and other NATO countries have not wanted to put any pressure on Ukraine to implement this agreement. Instead, they've been pumping weapons in and pushing, pumping weapons to Ukraine, that is, and trying to renegotiate the Minsk agreement. So this is simply the patience of Russia running out.
So, Mehmet, did Putin feel like that he had no other option but to raise the stakes and escalate this crisis?
Well, as my colleague just briefly explained the process, I think what's really happening is, we have to divide in 2 different segments, the problem, So from Russian perspective, from Putin's perspective, what's happening in Ukraine and Donbas area is actually something inside Ukraine. So Ukraine should negotiate with the breakaway regions if they want to solve the problem. From Putin's perspective, the real person, the real party to come around the same table with Putin himself should be United States. So this is completely different picture if we look at the situation from Putin's perspective. We know that, this is common sense that we never expect the P5 members, such as like Russia and United States, to, come face to face in a direct confrontation, and this should be avoided. And that's why, from Putin's taking, we understand that the threshold has already been passed, and what he has been expecting, waiting from the Western society, especially NATO members, especially from United States, is to just show some kind of sign that they would just live up to the promises they gave in all the way back in 2015. So
we're going to talk about this later during the discussion. But Peter, Russia's recent actions seem similar to what he did during Russia's conflict with Georgia in 2008 and the seizing of Crimea in 2014. Do you see that similarity? And is this part of the grand strategy by Putin to slowly reclaim territory he feels that belonged to Russia?
That is exactly the strategy we're seeing that is playing out. 2008 down to the fact that it was and yet another Olympics back in 2008, the Summer Olympics in the same city of Beijing, at the end of which Putin ordered an action against Georgia. We're seeing a very similar thing, just as the Beijing Olympics is wrapping up, is happening around Ukraine's borders. The false flag operations that we saw in Georgia are happening again. Russia's tactics are, as always, built almost extensively and exclusively on lies and deception. Let no one be deceived that Vladimir Putin is acting in a very deceitful manner in order to achieve his goal. And the goal is a reconstruction of the Soviet Union through other means, not in the same shape or form, not by trying to, deprive Ukraine of its flag, like, for example, or its seat in the UN. He could probably live with that. But
yes,
he wants to control Ukraine de facto. And, your previous speaker referred to the Minsk agreements and how the West has failed to force Ukraine to go and implement these agreements. Well, first of all, Russia refused to implement the very important component of the Minsk agreements, and that is Ukraine restoring control over its borders. And so in the way that Russia wanted to force Minsk agreements down Ukraine's throat meant capitulation by other means. The Chatham House, a premier British think tank, said it, that Minsk agreements, the way Russia wanted Ukraine to implement it, meant giving up on its sovereignty.
So Peter, can we say Poroshenko gave away too much in Minsk?
Well, we can say that obviously he was acting under duress. He wanted to. There was a serious military action and an attack by the Russians. So the priority was to, put an end to the attack. But the way that the Minsk agreements were designed, it took two sides to tangle. Let's say, it was first of all incumbent upon Russia to leave the territory and allow Ukraine to restore control over its border. As it is, there's no negotiation currently with any people's republics under Minsk agreements. You will be negotiating with Putin's puppet regimes. These are not Ukrainian splinter republics. These are agents of Russia. So it's really, you just have to see it for what it is.
Okay, so Glenn, has U.S. President Joe Biden played a role in provoking Putin? Because for weeks, we've seen Biden has been leaking Russian troop movements, saying an invasion was imminent and certain.
Well, obviously, the U.S. has been pushing the war propaganda for a while. I guess a key objective of this is to instill some bloc discipline, so get the Europeans on board and effectively have no compromise with Russia at this moment. But I would have to point out that I don't think the Georgian conflict is the best analogy. If you look back what happened in the early 2000s with Moldova, I think it would be actually much better. At this point, Moldova and the breakaway region of Transnistria, they had a negotiation under Russia, which was the Cossack Memorandum, and they reached an agreement for unifying the country, not that dissimilar from Ukraine. However, the day before signing, the US and the EU torpedoed the whole agreement. They pressured President Volodymyr to withdraw from it. And the reason why was because the compromise was that Moldova would remain neutral, not join NATO. And this is why they couldn't accept this peace in the US. Because, be very clear, this is the whole point of toppling the government in 2014 was to prepare it for NATO expansion. And this is effectively why the US has also been very much opposed to implementing the Minsk agreement. So I think that if they could have given up on these dreams of expanding NATO closer and closer to the Russian border, then they could have accepted this compromise. Because the Minsk agreement is very specific. Day one, they should start negotiating with Donbass, which they never did. And thereafter, they would get control the borders. And just on a final point, Russia's not actually mentioned in the Minsk agreement. It's only an agreement between Kyiv and Donbass. So
Yes.
Russia is not in Minsk II agreements.
So Putin had some very tough words for the Ukrainian government. Let's have a listen now, then we'll continue to talk.
We demand from those who captured and hold the power in Kiev to immediately end the combat activities. Otherwise, all responsibility for the possible continuation of the bloodshed will be entirely on the conscience of the regime ruling the territory of Ukraine.
So, Mehmet, it sounds like Putin is shifting blame onto the Ukrainian government. Does that mean he's going to go ahead with a wider invasion, or Putin has got what he wanted for the time being?
Well, I cannot, of course, just like anybody else, I cannot read the mind of Putin, of course, and I cannot just foresee what's going to happen next. I mean, we have to think in the situation from two different levels of analysis, I think. If we just put our magnifying glass exactly on Donbas region, and what's happening in Donbas region, it's obvious that something, breaking the law, breaking the territorial integrity of Ukraine, that's for sure. I have no question about it. But to better understand the situation and why this is happening, I'm afraid we have to just sit back and try to understand the wider picture. Why this is happening? One, why all of a sudden Putin just went ahead to recognize, unfortunately, these two breakaway republics. I mean, if you are asking me directly, I mean, of course, I cannot read the future. But if this is happening, well, if the relationship between United States and Russia, or NATO versus Russia, if something doesn't change dramatically about how to just set the tone of relationship between Russia and the West, unfortunately, I can say that something farther into Ukrainian territory can be expected, which I, of course, would not want to see it.
Yes,
and Turkey doesn't want to see it from where I am standing from.
So, Peter, U.S. President Biden immediately ordered sanctions on the two breakaway regions, but not the crippling sanctions on the whole of Russia. And White House says that these measures are separate to wider Western sanctions, which are ready to go if Russia invades Ukraine. So is Biden still giving a chance to diplomacy and a room for Putin to maneuver?
Yes, there's a serious faction in the White House, headed mostly by Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, who are strong proponents of this sort of diplomacy. They believe that sanctions should be preventative. They believe that should they go in strong with sanctions right away, that might just deprive Vladimir of any incentive to, meet them halfway. Having said that, obviously what we're seeing is this is a non-response. Slapping yet another round of sanctions against these embargoed entities, so-called people's republics, with no freedom of travel, with no legitimacy already, with no trade ties with anyone but the Russian Federation, absolutely. It is a joke, and the Ukrainian officials are currently saying that sanctions must be put in place right away. Vladimir Putin understands only strength and only credible threats. You are emboldening a dictator. You are whetting his appetite to go further and to continue trying what he can, how much farther he can go in Ukraine. So Ukrainians are very, very upset with President Biden because by acknowledging these republics, Mr. Putin has de facto, or actually de jure, invaded Ukraine by essentially recognizing the fact of their splinter.
Yes. So, Glenn, in last night's lengthy televised address, Putin described Ukraine as an integral part of Russia's history and said that the modern Ukraine was created by the USSR. Could this view expand so as to cover other former Soviet countries? And is Ukraine just the beginning?
Well, no, I don't think you're going to other countries. But in terms of Ukraine, how this crisis might expand from here on, that's, unfortunately, a huge risk here. So again, I'm I would be very empathetic towards Ukrainians who have, gone through this problem now with losing a chunk of their country. But it's also worth noting how insecure things are at the moment. You have the areas which in Donbass, which there's also the secessionists have held is not even a majority of the Donbass region. So what exactly does independence mean? Will Donbass will they seek to take over the entire Donbass region away from the government forces? And also, if the US-backed fighters, the government of Ukraine begins to shell and hit Russian soldiers, obviously they will hit back. At this point, they will obviously push them out of the entire Donbass region. But would they then also, if they do have to have direct confrontation and war with Ukraine, would they also then seek to push Ukraine's control over other Russian regions, Russian-friendly regions as well? Because it's important to note that Moscow does not view this government, which was installed after the coup, to be legitimate. So this could very easily get out of control, which is obviously very concerning for everyone involved. So I don't think that necessarily the US should go ahead with all sanctions, or the West go with all sanctions right away, because they need some leverage with Russia, because at the moment this can go in many different ways, and again, firing all your bullets right away would not be advisable.
In the meantime, Ukraine's President Zelenskyy was also clear in his response to Putin. Let's have a listen to what he said.
We agreed on the need to immediately impose sanctions for another act of aggression against Ukraine. These sanctions should include a complete halt to Nord Stream 2.
So, Peter, Zelenskyy says that Ukraine lies at the heart of the European security, and that he called for sanctions to include the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. How is that going to play out, and how do you think Germany will be acting moving forward?
It's a very, very hot button and toxic issue for Germany. The Chancellor knows that he will have some explaining to do if he decides to scrap the plan. Germany is the recalcitrant member that Vladimir Putin is very much counting on, along with Italy. And when it comes to NATO, obviously with his fellow traveler, Mr. Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, whom he views as allies of Russia. Germany depends 60% of its energy supplies on Russia. Italy comes not far close behind Nord Stream 2.
So, Mehmet, for weeks, NATO seemed divided on how to respond to what Russia, now that Putin has crossed a clear line here. Will it bring unity or more division to the alliance?
Well, I prefer the first one. I'd rather have the first one, but unfortunately, the division is it seems more relevant here. So what I see is, from the Zelensky's speech, he's always frustrated about the reaction from the Western allies. So this is credible, reasonable, when I look at the issue. So what Americans say versus what major European allies say is not just being on the same page, I should call them. So first of all, they need to have a very specific answer, and it must be credible from Putin's perspective. So when I just look into the situation, I can see two kinds of sanctions, twofold sanctions I can see in the near future, which is heavy economic sanctions to cripple Russian economy. I don't know how they can manage that. Or the second one is helping Ukrainians to defend their own country. This is probably the first thing President Zelenskyy is waiting from the Western allies. From Turkish perspective, if I just make a brief comment on that, it is very critical, obviously.
Yes, we'll see about that. Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I'm running off time, Mehmet. So, Glenn, for the past few weeks, French President Emmanuel Macron has been desperately trying to convince Putin to take the diplomacy path. But on the other hand, the US and the UK seem to have lost hope on that, saying that invasion was imminent and certain. Has this crisis exposed the US has a different vision or a goal for Europe than countries like France?
Definitely, because I think Ukraine is simply a symptom of a wider problem we have in Europe, and that's after the Cold War, Russia was weak. So for the past 30 years, Russia's asked to have some security guarantees. But again, for 30 years, Russia has been ignored because, again, it was weak. It didn't have to be taken into consideration. And this is kind of the impression that's now being held, that NATO only understand the language of force. Now, obviously, now that Russia's pushing back and drawing this red line saying no further, we see this division in the alliance. We see especially the French, but also lesser extent the Germans, are willing to rethink the decisions made in the 1990s, so creating a Europe without Russia, which then becomes unavoidably a Europe against Russia. But the US is still very much committed to this NATO hegemony in Europe, which marginalizes Russia. So I think some people are rethinking this, because keep in mind, this was the main reason for toppling the government of Ukraine in 2014. And also thereafter, what happened when Donbass refused to recognize the legitimacy of the new regime, in which the US backed the new government in Kyiv to launch the so-called anti-terrorist operation against Donbass. So I think if you can solve the European question, I think the Ukrainian question can be solved as well. So definitely there's a division between the Americans and the Europeans on this issue.
Yes, but there's also Turkiye. Turkiye also had a swift response to Russia's actions. Its foreign ministry said the decision of Russia to recognize the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk republics amounts to a clear violation of not only the Minsk agreements, but also Ukraine's political unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We find Russia's so-called decision to be unacceptable and rejected. So, Peter, how do you think Ankara will act moving forward, and what kind of implications this will have on Turkey's relations with Russia in the near future?
Well, it definitely sets a troubling precedent for Turkey. You know, Turkey has its own restive minorities that it has dealt with over the past few years. Obviously, does not want any sort of precedent to the north of it. You know, that's why it's been very cautious as far as the Crimea. It's walked a very delicate line between recognizing non-recognizing Crimea, but also trying to maintain good working relations with Russian Federation. You do the same thing with China. China, despite this Putin-Xi love fest that we saw in Beijing, that produced a communique which promised, which pledged this unlimited friendship between the two countries. China is also wary, and it made a statement that it does support Ukraine's territorial integrity. It does not want to go as far as to agree with Putin that there's no such country as Ukraine. And if you heard Vladimir Putin last night, he basically repeated his line, and that's what he honestly believes, folks. Let's not beat around the bush. Let's be very clear. Vladimir Putin does not believe in the legitimacy of a sovereign, independent Ukraine, period. He might contemplate a kind of a version of Ukraine, possibly landlocked with no access to the sea, having been deprived of Odessa, of all its, ports, etc. But the way Ukraine is right now, he is not happy with. And by going against Ukraine, he sets a very dangerous precedent for countries in the region, including Turkey. So,
Mehmet, Ukrainian President Zelenskyy said he'll be talking with Turkish President Erdogan on the phone. What should be expected from this call? It seems Turkey will not be able to mediate between Russia and Ukraine anymore. So which side do you think Turkey will take?
Well, as you noted, Turkey tried harder to bring these two leaders together, but unfortunately it didn't work out. But if you follow for some time, Turkey is providing the armed drones to Ukraine to defend their own country. So probably I can say that Turkey will be more than ready to help Ukrainians to defend. After all, this rhetoric, the rhetoric used by Putin is way too dangerous. That was from my point of view, outrageous. If you use these kind of historical narratives, what's going to be the next step? Anybody can use these kind of narratives, and after all, we know that Russia is made up of very different ethnicities, minorities by itself. So it can just make a boomerang effect in the long term if they do not respect international recognized borders. And definitely Turkey will be on the Ukraine side to to help them defend their own country. Yes. And you also noted that Turkey didn't recognize the annexation of Crimea at the first point. So that's going to be the continuation of the same policy of, staying with the recognized boundaries.
Yes. So since the situation is still fluid, we'll have to wait and see how the Western world will be addressing this issue. Gentlemen, unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk. And that's all for this edition of Straight Talk with me, Ayşe Süberkaş. Next time, I'll look at the latest round of talks between Turkiye and Armenia to see if their diplomatic outreach is gaining momentum. Until then, if you've got any comments, follow us and tweet us at Straight Talk TRT. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Until next time, take care and goodbye.